When addressing the problem of what consciousness even is, I found it useful to look at the question of behaviorism. And it asks, why do people behave the way they do? A very common answer for a lot of time has been because they felt that way. And you might hear this if you see your friend eating really ravenously after a long period of not eating. And you ask him, why are you eating like that? He tells you that because I felt hungry. This method of attributing mental states to your actions is called mentalism. And it's a way of explaining behavior. And it's been the most popular way to explain behavior for almost all of human history. There are these ideas of feelings, your personal will, and things that are very private inside your own mental world that no one else can observe. And these all influence the behavior you exhibit in everyday life. However, this leads to a problem called the mind-body problem. If there's a mental world that is private to you, and this mental world contains objects like wills and ideas that truly exist, how do they influence you in the real world? Because the you in the real world has objective facts about it. You can objectively say that you were eating at a certain point, but how could you objectively say that you were feeling hungry at a certain point? As science progressed further and further, there was this attempt to shift more towards reducing things to the physical. Like water, it could be reduced to hydrogen and oxygen, and sound, it could be reduced to pressure waves traveling through the air. Structuralists, they wanted to shift it away from attributing behaviors to mental objects going on inside your brain. So they instead became descriptive. They looked at macro scale patterns of human behavior, like maybe the purchases people make at certain ages. And they found that as you turn older, your purchases become more health focused. With structuralism, you can make predictions on how people will behave. But when people ask you to explain why someone behaved a certain way, you kind of have to resort to the mentalistic explanation, because structuralism doesn't do anything to position certain things as causes. B.F. Skinner, he was this 20th century behavioral scientist, and he wanted to describe human behavior with causes and effects, but he also didn't want to rely on mentalism, because mentalism is not scientifically rigorous. So what he did was something called methodological behaviorism, which is when you just strip the middle part of the inner world out and you treat it as a black box. So it's just an input going in and then there's an output going out. With the example about the hungry friend, a mentalist might explain it as he hasn't eaten in a while, therefore he felt hungry, so he picked up his fork and he chewed his food. And a methodological behaviorist, they might take a look at this and say, he felt hungry offers no explanation, and it doesn't really illuminate anything either. So they reduce it to, he hasn't eaten in a while, that's the stimulus, and the response is he picks up his fork and he eats more ravenously. So the way Skinner approached the mind-body problem is he was making a science and he was being pragmatic about it. So he kind of sidestepped it. To predict and study human behavior, you don't really need to look at what's going on inside the brain. And scientifically, it just might not be possible. So he just treated it as a black box and input-output function. And then, yeah, that's methodological behaviorism. Now, on the other hand, recently, I was reading this paper by a philosopher called Thomas Nagel. And the paper is called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Nagel looks at subjective experience, the first person of what it's like to be you. He sees these reductive physicalists saying that experience can be fully reduced to the physical. These people are saying that whatever experience is, it can be fully described, just like how water can be fully described as hydrogen and oxygen, it can be fully described as some collection of physical phenomena. Nagel disagreed with this, and he presented it with the pattern of how making things objective works. When you take the example of sound, sound is kind of a human way of describing these pressure waves coming into your ear. They vibrate your eardrum, and there's a whole mechanism behind delivering these electric signals to your brain. He thought that reducing sound to pressure waves was causally complete, that all of these things could describe sound. But when you try to do that with subjective experience, you kind of have to strip away the first person perspective on that. Kind of like how with the sound example, you removed how humans perceive sound, but you kept that sound was just a sequence of waves of air pressure kind of oscillating back and forth. And he says to do that with consciousness, you're removing the main part of the subject you're reducing, because consciousness is kind of that first person perspective. And if you remove the first person perspective from consciousness, what is there left? Nagel doesn't say that physicalism is wrong, but he kind of concludes his paper by saying, in order to understand or contemplate whether consciousness can even be described by physicalism, we have to understand the difference between the objective, the observable outside, and the subjective, which is what your first person perspective is. I found it pretty interesting to see how these two people took a look at the mind-body problem, and one being a scientist who needed a pragmatic way to study human behavior, and the other being a philosopher that wanted to understand if consciousness could even be reduced to the physical, how these two people approached this subject. And then going back to the problem of, does consciousness even exist? There are a group of people called eliminativists who assert that consciousness, as described, is merely a mislabeling of actual describable phenomena. And they say that consciousness and first-person experience are all perfectly reducible to neuroscience, this thing that we call a first-person experience. And our perspective, it could just be a mislabeling. A very common response to these eliminativists by a lot of people is that they assert their stance, so they must believe that it is true. And if they believe it's true, then beliefs are real. And since beliefs are mental objects, then eliminativism is false. And just my personal perspective on this, I think the whole problem of does consciousness exist might not be answerable, because we ask that in language, and with language you kind of constantly have to affirm that you're a being with mental states and these mental states exist, because language is represented inside your brain as real objects. Like, you can think of words and concepts and they all seem real to you. So I think that's mostly why everyone intuitively can understand that first-person experience exists. Maybe this doesn't prove that consciousness must exist, but it offers an insight to how this problem just might not be answerable with discussion. All right, that's all for today. See you on the flip side. Thanks for watching.